Step inside this downtown Los Angeles showroom, where blinding lights make everyone judge by appearances. Cold marble floors beneath polished glass walls screamed wealth and status. They reflected wealthy investors and loud journalists, people who pay fortunes just for shallow status. The air smelled of expensive perfume, masking the cheap arrogance inside. Right in the center of the grand stage, a single spotlight beamed down on the legendary Sterling Raven 1512. A silver-black luxury coupe that had remained totally dead for 18 years. CEO Vivian Sterling stood nearby, wearing a costly, sharp black designer dress. Her honey-brown hair styled perfectly to project total control. Desperate to look successful, she rehearsed this moment for 3 months. This classic car was her late father's pride and joy. She staged this flashy event promising a dead machine would suddenly roar to life. It was a desperate bid for respect from investors who judged her ability. She confidently raised the microphone, signaling the start of the show. A nervous young engineer slowly turned the key. The first try brought nothing but a hollow click. The second try flickered some dashboard lights, but they died as quickly as they flashed. By the third failure, an awkward silence grew so heavy the crystal chandeliers above seemed to hum with embarrassment. Anxious whispers quickly rippled across the room. Clinton Avery, a 60-year-old billionaire whose $90 million check could easily save or kill the brand, impatiently glanced at his luxury watch. Behind him, a 52-year-old board member who had spent years plotting her complete ruin, flashed a smug, thin smile. But you and I can see a figure half hidden behind the velvet rope. A quiet mechanic in a faded denim shirt stood there, one hand resting gently on his small daughter's shoulder. Elias Walker was deemed too ordinary to be a real guest. He was just cheap, outsourced labor, hired to tow the cars into this rich playground. His heavy boots were scuffed and dirty. His hands bore that permanent engine grease, the mark of real labor they all despised. Beside him, 6-year-old Matilda clutched a cheap toy car like it was pure gold. As the third attempt failed, Elias tilted his head. He murmured quietly, seeing right through the expensive failure without needing an audience. That engine is not dead. It is just out of sequence. Vivian overheard him. If she didn't judge him by his clothes, she might have asked why. But blinded by the arrogant spotlight, with wealthy rivals and investors mocking her, she panicked and did the very thing her father warned against. She used her shallow pride as a shield. Turning to the dusty mechanic in denim, she stepped off her grand platform and projected her voice across the cold marble floor. "Start the engine," she smirked coldly, "and I will date you." The wealthy crowd roared. A chuckle rose from the bar, spreading like a pricey glass shattering across a silent, judgmental room. A reporter typed the mockery, "But you and I know better." Elias didn't answer. He didn't even flinch. He just reached down, shielding his daughter's ears from the venom. The exact way a father shields his child from a siren. But Matilda already felt their cruel judgment. Her tiny fingers gripped a toy car until her knuckles turned bone white. Let's look back, long before they judged him to rural Oregon. Elias spent his childhood in a dusty garage, looking like an ordinary mechanic. He understood classic engines the way other children understand nursery rhymes. By the time he was only 12 years old, he could diagnose a failing fuel pump just by listening to it breathe. At 20, elite shops begged for his help, completely ignoring his lack of a degree. He possessed raw talent and saw value in engines that everyone else wrote off as trash. He met Sarah at a county fair when he turned 23. A schoolteacher, she saw past the grease and instantly softened the rough edges of his world. "Your daddy doesn't just fix cars with his hands," she'd whisper to little Matilda. "He fixes them by listening." Matilda was only 4 when a rainy highway took Sarah away one Tuesday. A late drive home after a routine parent-teacher conference. Devastated, Elias shut his garage down for almost 12 months. He kept working, but those high-paying offers from prestigious auto shops, they all demanded heavy travel, taking away precious time he simply couldn't afford to lose. He walked away, quietly choosing the low-status, unglamorous life of a mobile mechanic instead, fixing rusty farm generators and trucks for local folks who paid in crumpled cash. The money was tight, but it meant he could always pick Matilda up from school and make her lunch every morning. and sitting by her bed every night, reading until her eyes finally closed. Society judges success by status, but to him her smile beat any shiny promotion. Matilda clung to a tiny toy car her mother bought right before the crash. A simple die-cast coupe, its metal wheels rubbed smooth from her constant nervous grip. Whenever she desperately missed her mother, she would roll it across the table and ask him the very same question. "Do you think Mom will know if I finally see a real one someday? You and I know he took this humble showroom job despite the pathetic pay. But the listing promised legendary vintage cars would be on display. He had dared to hope, just for a moment, that his daughter might finally see the silver coupe she dreamed of. He never cared about attention or the spotlight. Picture a smug CEO mocking his plain clothes in front of 200 wealthy guests, daring this simple mechanic to start a dead engine on stage. And Matilda, who had been so excited she practically inhaled her breakfast that morning, was now staring at the floor, crushed under the weight of their cruel judgment. Yet Vivian Sterling wasn't always this blinded by status and wealth. Her father was once a humble, quiet master of vintage car restoration. He built their empire with his own hands, turning a greasy garage into a respected name at elite classic car shows. But we know he died suddenly in his driveway right after she turned 10. The whole company had been drifting aimlessly since then. When 26-year-old Vivian stepped in as chief executive, Sterling Heritage was bleeding cash. The market had already shifted toward electric collector cars. William Crawford spent 2 years rallying older board members who prejudged Vivian. Well, as he loved sneering behind closed doors, a rich heiress just playing with her father's tools. This massive buyout was supposed to silence those doubters. $90 million in funding, museum partnerships, and access to elite collector networks. But Clinton Avery laid down his strict terms. Crystal clear during their first meeting 6 months ago. Sterling Heritage would only get funded if they could prove publicly that they still possessed the true mastery to revive their historic legends. Stories meant nothing to him, he demanded raw engine noise. So Vivian chose the Raven V12 Tart, her late father's favorite classic. A legendary car that had not started since the morning he died. She hid a dark secret, despite 3 months of grueling expert effort. Her elite mechanics could not get that Raven to start. She kept reassuring herself that on the night of the gala, under high pressure with the right specialist standing by, it would finally run, but the engine remained dead. Let's observe this together. When Elias spoke from the shadows, Vivian was already falling. She could hear her rival William taking a satisfied breath nearby. She noticed the sudden shift in Clinton's eyes. That instant, cold recalculation every wealthy investor makes before walking away from a dead deal. She looked at Elias but only saw his cheap uniform missing his raw talent. She only saw a low-wage nobody, a silent witness who watched her fail miserably. In her panic, she chose to mock his appearance instead of admitting defeat. William leaned in close to whisper a threat only she could hear. "If that car does not run in 5 minutes," he muttered, "you better be ready to sign the sale papers tonight." We all know how this goes. After her challenge, the wealthy crowd turned vicious, mocking a working-class man with polished cruelty. Some rich kid near the press line laughed, desperate to please his peers. A woman dripping in diamonds whispered to her friend, flashing a nasty grin. An engineer near the back muttered loud enough for others to hear, "3 expert teams could not fix this. What is a cheap part-timer going to do?" Carter Briggs, the head of security, was already stepping forward. He was 41, broad-shouldered, armed with that polite hostility bred from serving wealthy elites for years. He stopped near Elias, glaring at little Matilda as if she were dirt on his clean floor. "Your shift is over," Carter snapped at him. "Take the kid outside before she ruins the rest of our VIP program." You and I have heard comments like that. It hit like a heavy blow. Little Matilda flinched, judged harshly despite doing nothing wrong. See this with me. A quiet girl holds a toy car, watching wealthy snobs overlook her father's mastery. To the judgmental eyes in that high-end showroom, real genius just did not look the part. True talent rarely wears a suit. Guards were paid to keep working-class heroes like him far from the pristine display cars. Elias knelt down quietly, gently adjusting his daughter's worn coat. He completely ignored the glaring security guard. He spoke softly, focusing his energy entirely on the one person who mattered. "It is okay, sweetie, let's just go." He knew exactly how these shallow environments judged. Blue-collar workers learn fast that rich folks only see them as temporary tools. You remain unseen until their machine breaks, then vanish the second it runs smoothly again. Real masters bear that cheap judgment without losing their dignity. His daughter had not learned that harsh social truth yet, and he refused to rush it. Squeezing her tiny hand, he turned slowly toward the exit. The wealthy crowd parted, wearing expressions of shallow pity rather than respect, backing away as if avoiding a dirty stray being kicked out of a gala. The wealthy executive, Vivian, felt a sudden wave of shame beneath her expensive armor. She saw the kid's face and the father's quiet resolve. His genuine grace exposed the hollow nature of her flashy, desperate need for attention. She made the fatal error of judging someone who had nothing to prove to her. So she doubled down. "If you can actually start that wreck," she sneered, performing for the cameras. "I will keep my word, dinner daddy-o, a date." Right in front of everyone. The high-class audience laughed cruelly once more. She thought she was being witty, but she just sounded cheap. Elias stopped. "Here is the turning point. Watch with me," as he glares back over his shoulder. No anger showed, just the serene absolute confidence only a master mechanic possesses. He saw clearly now. This shallow woman was not just mocking his oil-stained overalls. She did not realize her mistake. She was showing his daughter that hard-working people are just punchlines to the wealthy. He tried to pull his daughter away, but the girl stood her ground firmly. She stopped right by the platform and absolutely refused to move an inch. Her knuckles turned pale, clutching her cheap little toy car tightly. Tears filled her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She looked past the polished marble, staring directly at the shiny million-dollar vehicle. Then she looked at her father, whispering in a soft, trembling voice. It was that fragile voice children use when their entire world feels unsafe. "Daddy, Mama said you could fix anything." Ellis shut his eyes, breathing slowly. No one had said those words to him in 2 long years. He had only heard them in his memory, spoken in his late wife's voice. On dark nights when his body ached and their bank account was empty. When the future was just endless grime, fixing old engines to buy basic groceries. But her fierce belief, right here under these snobbish gallery lights, changed everything. He remembered his wife telling their baby that, right before the terrible accident. Let's reflect on this together. He was repairing a junk car that everyone else dismissed. Back then, Sarah would stand in the doorway, balancing little Matilda on her hip. She always spoke with that same quiet, unshakable confidence. Every word carried absolute certainty, as if she knew exactly how life worked. Let's be honest, if Elias walked away right now, nobody could blame him. Any sensible man would just walk out. But that would teach his daughter that when rich crowds mock you, hiding is safer even when you hold the truth. She would carry that bitter defeat into school and job interviews for the rest of her life. But a real father does not teach fear. He turned right back around. The cruel snickers from the wealthy crowd still echoed in the room. Right up front, several rich, smug faces were still grinning. The elegant CEO stood with arms crossed, projecting power for the flashing press cameras. William Crawford was already whispering to Clinton Avery, trying to save face in public. Without saying a single word, Elias approached the main stage. Every step was deliberate, holding his little daughter's hand. He stopped right in front of Vivian. "I will try," he said. He did not shout. True strength is quiet, and the whole showroom fell silent. "But not for your clock. I am doing this because my daughter believes in me." Any remaining laughter from the wealthy spectators vanished in an instant. Vivian froze. Nobody in her rich world ever dared to challenge her so bluntly. This poorly dressed mechanic standing there was not begging for her approval. Honestly, he barely seemed to notice her designer clothes or status. He was just a father armed with his child's trust, making those rich spectators look completely foolish. 3 minutes, the CEO finally snapped. Her sharp tone dropped, suddenly wary of his quiet power. "You get 3 minutes." Elias walked up to the main stage, approaching that gorgeous vintage coupe. He did not pop the hood or ask for expensive diagnostic gear. He did not even look at their official technical files. Instead, he just pressed his bare palm flat against the vintage front fender, bowing his head as if he were listening to a sleeping animal breathe. A young, arrogant engineer standing near the back let out a mocking laugh. Is he praying? But the experienced George Bennett was not laughing. George was 58 years old, the chief engineer of the firm, and the very last mechanic who had actually worked alongside the founder. Inside their original legendary Long Beach auto shop, he watched this ordinary-looking father touch the classic car, and he recognized that focused stance right away. It was the stance of a master who poured his life into engines. This was not cheap theater, it was a master diagnosis. Try the ignition again, Elias calmly requested. But hold the key halfway right before you turn it over. The young engineer looked at Vivian, and she simply nodded. Let's watch closely. He turned the key, paused, and cranked. This time, right in that brief pause, a beautiful, gentle hum woke up from deep under the dashboard. The sound lived for a second, then faded. Elias slowly opened his eyes. Who replaced the ignition switch but left the original key barrel in place? These elite engineers froze. Then George Bennett finally spoke up. That barrel belonged to Henry Sterling. We kept it for authenticity. The switch behind it was upgraded last year for reliability. Elias nodded slowly. That is the real problem. You are trying to start a classic car using modern logic. The vintage engine does not recognize the sequence. Vivian frowned at him. Meaning what? We often judge by a dirty uniform, but he turned to her, no longer the low-class help, but a true master who knew his craft. The motor is not dead, the fuel system is completely fine. The ignition is not broken either. This vehicle is locking itself out. There is an older protective circuit built into this. A design that cuts fuel flow if the start sequence is not followed in perfect order. That is why the secondary pump runs for 1 second, and then just shuts down. It is not a mechanical failure, it is a refusal. A proud senior technician on the showroom platform, embarrassed by this low-status man, aggressively pushed back. We have tested every single electrical line in this car. Elias kept his calm voice. You tested what a modern diagnostic computer can see. But there are custom things her father built into this classic before computers were ever bolted to dashboards. Mentioning her father pierced her wealthy armor deeper than he intended. Vivian stared. She finally looked past the dirty overalls, realizing his intense gaze did not belong to some struggling, desperate part-timer. He knelt among the pedals, his grease-stained hand gently tracing the underside of the classic dashboard with patient reverence. Like a master surgeon feeling for a faint pulse. There is a hidden kill switch somewhere along here, he whispered, mostly to himself. And if I am right, nobody in this entire room has ever found it. Elias pulled a cheap flashlight from his pocket, casting a bright beam deep under the dusty dashboard. He did not yank anything loose. He slowly traced the wires with 2 fingers, carefully studying the old layer of dust. He saw the tiny scrapes on the metal lip and the faint fading along a painted seam, where decades ago a master mechanic had hidden a custom panel under factory paint. George Bennett stepped closer, feeling his throat tighten in sudden awe. Think about it. He suddenly recalled a secret ignored for nearly 20 years. In his final years, Henry Sterling had deeply distrusted modern digital systems. The brilliant builder was famous for hiding mechanical, anti-theft security systems of his own design inside his personal cars. He always loved saying that a car with a true soul had to keep a secret. Vivian heard George take a sharp breath. She was confused until her late father's voice suddenly echoed clearly in her mind. At 7 years old, sitting on a half-restored car, she heard Henry drop his wrench and say those exact words. A car with a soul ought to have a secret. We often dismiss childhood wisdom as simple fairy tales, and she was no different. Elias stopped his fingers on a tiny, rectangular hidden panel beneath the column, seamlessly disguised to match the dash. It was hidden so deep, a casual glance would easily miss it. Under a dusty cover lay a tiny lever, completely locked by 18 years of grit and old hardened grease. There, he whispered softly. He calmly explained what this rare Raven V12 engine actually required. Just turning the key wasn't enough. This classic demanded a precise, careful sequence. First, turn the key halfway to start the pump, then press the clutch flat. Next, pull that hidden lever gently to open up the secondary fuel valve. Then, wait a moment for the pressure to build. Only after those steps would the powerful engine roar alive. The high-priced restoration crew, stuffed in modern parts, completely jamming that vital hidden switch. Naturally, their expensive diagnostic computers kept throwing errors. They blamed the car, but it was just built exactly as Henry Sterling intended. The machine refused to start for arrogant people who only knew how to yell. Vivian walked off the stage, stepping directly toward the open driver's side door. She finally dropped the arrogant boss act and stopped shouting out commands. Instead, she approached with the quiet curiosity of a child. One who is standing near something her father once lovingly built. "How did you know my father designed it that way?" she whispered as Elias kept working. "Because true classic car builders never put a switch where it is obvious. They place it where only someone who actually stops to listen can find it." Vivian froze. "You and I know how easily we misjudge people by their outward looks." She realized with sudden, painful clarity that this was true of her own father. And it was absolutely true of the dusty mechanic she had so easily dismissed. The humble working man she had arrogantly mocked just 10 minutes earlier. Elias calmly reached for the hidden switch. But before he could touch it, a harsh voice cut through the silent room. "Step away from the car," William Crawford barked, marching aggressively toward them. His cold expression showed the sheer panic of an executive terrified that his entire career might vanish in 30 seconds. Dismissing the humble mechanic as a nobody, he glared directly at Vivian. "You cannot let some cheap contractor touch a $2 million showroom piece right in front of our key investors. If anything goes wrong, it is entirely on you." He turned back to Clinton Avery, instantly wearing his fake, polite executive smile. "Mr. Avery, I apologize deeply for this embarrassing little scene tonight. We will stop the presentation immediately and discuss our deal in private." It was a calculated executive play designed to sweep his own panic under the rug, while quietly destroying Vivian's career as chief executive in the process. Vivian silently stared at Clinton. The billionaire remained quiet, but his sharp eyes were calculating the real situation. "You and I know he wasn't judging the car. He was testing her character." Slowly, she looked back at the machine. True genius never needs to argue. Elias quietly backed away without a word. He heard the threat clearly and understood completely. Standing up, he slowly wiped his grease-stained hands on a ragged cloth from his pocket. "It is your choice to stop me," Elias murmured, looking at her with pure calm. "But if you stop now, this car stays silent. Not because it cannot run, but because nobody has ever been patient enough to listen." You and I can almost hear her father's voice echoing now. Old machines do not shout out their faults. You have to be patient enough to hear them. She stared down at the cold, polished floor. Little Matilda stood completely still near the edge of the stage. Her tiny hands gripped her cheap silver toy car so tightly. She saw past his worn clothes, watching her dad with the pure faith Vivian once felt. Back when life was simple, in a gritty shop smelling of grease and orange peels. This is not just about a car, Vivian realized with sudden sharp clarity. This is about a child waiting for this judgmental world to admit her father is the master she knows he is. She stood tall, looking past his rugged look. "Let him finish." William snapped his head around in disbelief. "Vivian, let him finish, William." She did not shout, but her quiet authority cut right through. "I take responsibility." Elias stood there, calmly absorbing the silence. He stepped back toward the door, holding her gaze with quiet dignity. "If I'm right about this," he said, "you should be the one to start it." The entire room shifted. The technical staff turned in shock. William opened his mouth, then shut it. "Your father built it," Elias told her. "If it is going to make a sound again, the first person to hear it should be you." Let's watch together as the powerful CEO climbs into the dusty classic. The worn leather, cracked and dismissed as junk, sighed beneath her weight. The scent rising from the cabin brought back her humble childhood. It smelled of her father's working-class hands, from a lifetime before she became rich. All that polished corporate armor she wore to fit into this wealthy world just melted away quietly. Under these bright lights, her expensive title and high status simply ceased to exist. She was just a daughter, holding the wheel of a car others called trash, praying that her father's crude creation would still respond to her. Elias stood back. A man with real skill never needs to boast. He spoke softly, guiding her like a master surgeon with a patient. "Turn the key only halfway, do not crank it yet." Wait for the auxiliary pump. She slowly turned the key. The old dashboard hummed quietly, a soft whisper from a sleeping giant. Press the clutch all the way to the floor and hold it. She pressed down. Now reach under the dashboard. Do you feel the small lever? Her trembling fingers found the worn metal tab where his grease-stained hands had been. Pull it gently, do not force it. This old machine hates being forced. She carefully pulled the lever out by just a fraction of an inch. A soft, almost sacred click echoed in the quiet. The judgmental millionaires standing near the platform completely stopped breathing. Even the billionaire Clinton Avery silently stepped a bit closer. William Crawford stood frozen, his smug corporate mask finally cracking wide open. And Carter Briggs, you and I saw his arrogant smirk vanish. Look at him, we easily dismiss a man standing with his eyes down. Little Matilda stood by George Bennett, watching that open driver's door. Her small face lifted, giving him her absolute quiet attention. Elias just listened 1 silent second. 2 seconds, then 3. Deep behind the firewall, fuel pressure built and finally leveled out. That low hum smoothed out into a quiet, steady tone. He gave 1 nod now. Vivian turned the ignition key all the way. For 1 agonizing, breathless moment, we heard only the dry click of a starter fighting a dead engine. William almost smirked. Clinton's eyes narrowed just a tiny bit. Time stretched out like a held breath. Then, roaring like a massive beast waking up, the classic V12 engine caught. A deep rumble roared from the bay, building into a rich, steady idle. The kind of vintage mechanical music no modern factory can replicate. A pure sound that classic car collectors fly across oceans to hear. Even the expensive crystal chandeliers above shook slightly from the raw power. Even the cold marble floor seemed to stop and listen. After 18 years of absolute silence, the Sterling Raven V12 was alive. Vivian's hands, tight on the steering wheel, began to shake. Staring through the classic windshield, her eyes finally filled with tears. She held those tears back. She did not need to cry, we all saw them. You and I see past the wealthy executive facade. A daughter just heard her father's legacy return. She slowly turned, staring at the scruffy mechanic through the open driver's door. There was no pride on her face, no cheap triumph. Only a look of pure astonishment and deep, humble gratitude. And beneath that lay a powerful feeling she could not even define yet. For the first few moments, after that vintage engine settled into its rhythm, nobody in the crowd dared to applaud. They did not lack admiration, they simply had no breath. This was the machine 3 professional engineering teams completely failed to start. The exact vehicle that nearly cost the company a $90 million investment. Now that legendary machine was humming smoothly under the showroom lights. Saved by a working-class man in scuffed boots, whom they mockingly dismissed just 15 minutes ago. Finally, the slow clapping actually started. It began in one corner, right by the reporters, where a journalist preparing a corporate obituary suddenly had a far more shocking story to file. The applause spread outward like a wave across the polished marble floor. By the time the sound finally reached the back of the room, even the stubborn executives allied with William Crawford were clapping out of pure, stunned professional reflex. Clinton Avery turned to his assistant and spoke without showing any emotion. "Prepare the contract. We are definitely proceeding." William Crawford's smug face quickly went pale as wax. His entire 2-year scheme was completely over. Just like that, their entire scheme to force a sale collapsed with 1 simple turn of a key. Ruined by a man he judged as just a useless contractor in a memo weeks ago. Carter Briggs backed away instinctively, unable to look the man he had dismissed in the eye. Staring at the floor, he felt a strange new emotion. He was actually deeply ashamed. George Bennett did not applaud. He just stood there, arms at his side, staring at Elias with absolute, intense focus. His face showed a quiet respect he had not shown anyone since Henry Sterling passed away. But the most meaningful moment in that room had absolutely nothing to do with applause. It belonged to a little girl wearing a navy coat, who had waited by the stage and now sprinted across the highly polished marble in 3 quick steps, throwing her arms tightly around her dad's waist. "I knew you could do it, Daddy," Matilda whispered, her voice cracking with the tears of a brave kid who refused to cry in public. "I knew." Elias knelt down and pulled her close. He did not care about the flashing cameras. He ignored the wealthy CEO completely. He ignored Clinton Avery, the wealthy investor whose money could have changed his life. He only had eyes for his daughter. He rested his forehead against hers, taking one long, incredibly slow breath. You and I know that breath, the quiet relief of a tired soul finally standing tall after years of being pushed down. Vivian slowly stepped down from the vintage vehicle. She crossed the wooden stage until she stood directly in front of Elias. The small microphone pinned to her high-end designer dress was still fully active. Everyone in the showroom would hear her next words, but she left it on. I was wrong about you, she admitted, making absolutely no excuses about stress. She did not blame the board, and she refused to hide behind a joke for the reporters. I judged your dirty work clothes before I looked at the real man inside them. I am sorry. The crowd, who had just caught their breath to applaud, fell completely silent once again. But this was a completely different kind of silence. The heavy, respectful silence that follows an honest sentence. Elias stood up, holding Matilda tight, without a single trace of smugness. He gave a quiet, respectful nod. Thank you, Miss Sterling. Just like that, within 20 minutes of that powerful engine roaring, the entire event transformed from a total disaster into a massive triumph. The wealthy investors stayed. Clinton Avery's lawyers sat in the back, rewriting the deal with much better terms. William Crawford slipped out through a back exit. He would resign within 10 days. Vivian Sterling did not stick around for cheap praise. She quietly slipped away from the media. She told her assistant to handle the final closing speech and vanished down the corridor, leaving the showroom behind for the quiet loading docks. She saw Elias in the staff hallway, down on one knee, buttoning his daughter's coat. He had turned down interviews and rejected a large cash bonus from the staff. He simply wanted to get his little girl dressed and head home. You and I know that real worth is never defined by appearance or status. A quiet, hidden service hallway hummed away. Under harsh lights, the faint roar of that V12 engine echoed from upstairs. The wealthy executive stopped just feet away. She had abandoned her designer heels, holding them casually in one hand. Without her expensive armor, she finally looked like a human, not a brand. You are going to leave, she said, without letting me thank you. Elias quietly buttoned his daughter's cheap coat before looking up. I did the job I came for. No, Vivian replied quickly. You did far more. You saved my entire car company. And you did it right after I humiliated you before 200 people. He didn't strike back. True talent doesn't need to. He simply replied, You are not the first to judge my hands over my work. That quiet truth stung. It showed her that her arrogant judgment of his dirty clothes was completely unoriginal. Her bias was completely ordinary. We both know how easily society dismisses working men. He had quietly tolerated that same shallow bias for years. Then let me be the first to apologize properly, Vivian offered. She offered him a permanent role. A senior consulting position right at Sterling Motors Heritage, managing the restoration of their most legendary historic vehicles. Full creative control and a salary that would let him ditch his battered work truck forever. Elias did not rush to accept. He simply looked down at Matilda. The little girl watched closely, already sensing that a fancy black dress did not mean this woman could be trusted yet. No matter how sensitive cars. My time belongs to my daughter, the mechanic replied. I do not take jobs that keep me from her school plays, or her conferences, or our quiet dinners together. Vivian knelt on the floor to meet the child at eye level. Then we will build his work around your school schedule, she promised. She ignored her own status and treated the child with total respect. If your father works with me, the job fits your life, not the other way around. Matilda quietly judged her for a long moment, evaluating her character the same way she would look at a stray dog before trusting it. Then, with the unfiltered honesty of a young child, she asked, Are you really going to date my dad? The quiet hallway became absolutely silent. A faint, quiet smile appeared on Elias's face. Vivian, the powerful executive who easily dominated high-stakes business meetings, was suddenly left completely speechless. A warm blush ruined her perfectly polished appearance, proving that status cannot hide basic human emotions. Elias looked at the wealthy CEO, finding genuine amusement behind her expensive professional facade. That bold promise was yours, he reminded her, not mine. Vivian stood up slowly, meeting his gaze directly. I am a top executive, she replied. I never break my promises. A quiet, surprising chuckle escaped the humble mechanic. You see, true capability doesn't care about appearances. For the first time in months, he genuinely laughed. But he refused to soak up their hypocritical applause. Real talent does not need a fancy suit to prove its worth. Just coffee, he muttered. No cameras, no wealthy investors. And absolutely nobody, he added, looking down at his sweet, upturned face, at my little girl. The CEO quietly nodded, agreed. They walked away from the flashing lights, leaving the shallow crowd behind. Far behind them in the silent showroom, the classic engine kept idling, steady, low, and incredibly patient. That is how true mastery waits when a real mechanic finally revives it. To the CEO, that rich rumble meant her family legacy was alive again. To the humble mechanic, it proved his daughter was right to believe in him when others laughed. For the little girl walking right between them, clutching a toy in one hand and her dad's calloused fingers in the other, it was the night her quiet father made a room full of wealthy, judgmental snobs stand and applaud. Between the working-class mechanic and the CEO, it was not love yet. It was something far better suited for a genuine fresh start. It was mutual respect, quietly and undeniably earned. And you and I know, this respect built the foundation for everything that followed. After